The story always ends the same way in the movies. A man walks into a courtroom. He looks over his shoulder, half expecting a bullet that never comes. Instead, he trades names for years, faces for freedom, loyalty for survival. Then he disappears into suburbia, into obscurity, into a life that looks almost normal. That is the version people remember. But the truth was far darker. According to multiple documented accounts, the real lives of mafia informants rarely resembled the quiet safety promised under witness protection. Their endings were not clean. They were not cinematic. And more often than not, they were unfinished. Because in the world they came from, betrayal did not simply fade away. It lingered. It waited. And sometimes it followed. By the late 1960s, organized crime in America had evolved into something both rigid and deeply entrenched. The five families of New York operated like corporations, structured hierarchies, coded rules, and a culture built on silence. Omerta was not just a principle. It was survival. Men who entered this world did so knowing one truth. Loyalty was permanent, or so they believed. Among those men was a low-level associate who would later become something far more dangerous. Not because of the crimes he committed, but because of the secrets he carried. His name was not widely known at first. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't a captain. He wasn't even a made man. But he was close enough to see everything, and close enough to understand how it all worked. He grew up in a neighborhood where organized crime wasn't hidden. It was visible, normalized, and often admired. Expensive cars lined the streets. Well-dressed men spoke in low tones outside social clubs. Respect was measured not by law, but by fear. From an early age, he understood the hierarchy. Who mattered? Who didn't? And what happened to those who made the wrong choices? His first steps into that world were small. Running errands, delivering messages, watching and learning. These tasks weren't glamorous, but they were deliberate. Trust wasn't given. It was tested. And he passed. By his early 20s, he had become a reliable presence around more established figures. He wasn't important enough to be noticed by law enforcement, but he was trusted enough to be included in conversations that mattered. That made him valuable and dangerous, because what he began to see wasn't just crime. It was structure. Loan sharking operations that quietly drained entire neighborhoods. Illegal gambling networks that stretched across state lines. Violence that was rarely impulsive and almost always strategic. Nothing happened without purpose. Nothing happened without approval. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever spoken about outside the circle. For years, he followed the rules. He kept his head down. He earned money. He proved loyalty. And like many before him, he believed that loyalty would be enough to protect him. But loyalty in that world was conditional, and conditions could change overnight. The shift began subtly. A deal gone wrong, a payment delayed, a conversation that didn't sit right. At first, it seemed like routine tension, the kind that always existed beneath the surface. But according to later testimonies, something had changed within the organization itself. Paranoia had begun to spread. Law enforcement pressure was increasing. Federal investigations were becoming more aggressive. Surveillance techniques were improving. And for the first time, the idea of internal betrayal was no longer unthinkable. It was expected. Men who had spent decades operating in silence suddenly found themselves questioning everything and everyone. Trust eroded, and suspicion replaced it. For someone like him, close enough to hear things, but not powerful enough to control outcomes, that shift was catastrophic. He began to notice how quickly people disappeared. One week, a familiar face would be present at meetings, laughing, collecting money, exchanging information. The next week, they were gone. No explanation, no discussion, just absence. And in that world, absence meant only one thing. According to multiple documented accounts, executions within organized crime were rarely dramatic. There were no public displays, no warnings, just quiet removals, efficient, calculated, and final. He understood that. Everyone did. But understanding something and living under its constant shadow were two very different things. The pressure began to build, not from law enforcement, not yet, but from within. Small interactions started to feel different. Conversations became shorter. Eyes lingered a little longer than they should have. Questions were asked in ways that felt deliberate, as if answers were being measured, as if every word mattered. And slowly, the realization began to form. He was no longer just part of the system. He was being evaluated by it. The exact reason remains unclear, even in later investigations. Some accounts suggest that a financial discrepancy raised suspicion. Others point to a minor association with someone already under scrutiny. But in that world, suspicion didn't need to be proven. It only needed to exist. And once it did, it spread. By the early 1970s, federal authorities had intensified their efforts against organized crime. The introduction of new legal tools allowed prosecutors to build cases that were previously impossible. Surveillance, wiretaps, and long-term investigations began to expose patterns that had remained hidden for decades. For the first time, the structure itself was vulnerable. And for the first time, insiders became the most valuable assets. Informants. The word itself carried weight. It wasn't just betrayal, it was the ultimate violation. Those who cooperated with authorities didn't just risk their own lives. They erased their identities within the criminal world entirely. Their names became warnings. Their existence became examples. And their endings were rarely peaceful. At some point, the pressure from both sides collided. On one side, the organization that had begun to question his loyalty. On the other, federal agents who had started to take interest in him, not as a suspect, but as an opportunity. According to investigators, the approach was calculated. It always was. They didn't threaten him. They didn't rush him. They presented facts, evidence, possibilities, and most importantly, consequences. Because by then, the situation had become clear. If the organization decided he was a liability, there would be no trial, no explanation, no second chance, just a quiet disappearance. And if law enforcement built a case against him, the outcome wasn't much better. Years behind bars, alone, forgotten. For the first time in his life, loyalty was no longer the safest option. It was the most dangerous one. The decision did not come quickly. Men like him were conditioned against it. Cooperation wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. The psychological barrier alone was enough to stop most from ever considering it. But fear has a way of reshaping principles, especially when survival is no longer guaranteed. The exact moment he decided to talk has never been fully confirmed. There was no recorded confession, no dramatic turning point captured in transcripts, just a shift from silence to cooperation, from insider to informant. And with that shift, everything changed. He began to provide information, names, locations, operations, details that only someone embedded within the organization could know. According to multiple documented accounts, the value of his testimony was immediate. Investigators were able to connect previously isolated cases. Patterns emerged. Networks became visible. It was the kind of breakthrough law enforcement had been waiting for. But every piece of information came with a cost. Because while he was speaking to federal agents, the organization he had once been part of was beginning to notice something else. Things were going wrong. Operations were being disrupted. Arrests were being made. And patterns, once invisible, were suddenly being exposed. Inside the organization, there was only one explanation. Someone was talking. And as suspicion spread, so did something else. A search, quiet at first, then more focused, then relentless. Because in that world, identifying an informant wasn't just about stopping the damage. It was about sending a message that would outlive the individual, a message that would restore fear. By the time he realized how close they were to identifying him, the protection he thought he had begun to feel started to fade. Because protection, like loyalty, was conditional, and conditions were changing. The film never showed what happened next. But according to those who later reviewed the case files, the moment everything shifted came not during an interrogation, not during a courtroom appearance, but during a single, routine observation made by someone inside the organization. A detail, small, almost insignificant, but enough to connect everything. And once that connection was made, there was no going back. According to multiple documented accounts, the realization did not spread through the organization all at once. It moved quietly, the way information always did in that world, through whispers, coded conversations, and carefully chosen intermediaries. No one said his name at first. They didn't need to. The suspicion alone was enough to begin the process. Because in organized crime, certainty was a luxury. Action was not. The man who first noticed the inconsistency wasn't a boss, nor a high-ranking figure. He was something far more dangerous, an observer. Someone whose role existed in the margins, watching patterns, tracking movement, noticing when routines shifted even slightly. He had seen something that didn't fit. A meeting that should have remained private had been compromised. A transaction, routine, controlled, had been intercepted. And most importantly, the timing aligned too perfectly with someone who had recently begun to behave differently. More cautious, less visible, present, but never fully present. It was enough. The information moved upward, carefully, deliberately, until it reached men who understood what it meant. According to investigators who later reconstructed the timeline, the leadership did not react emotionally. There were no immediate orders, no sudden violence. That wasn't how decisions like this were made. They watched, they waited, and they tested. Because confirming an informant required more than suspicion, it required proof. And proof, in that world, often came at the cost of someone else's life. The first test was subtle. False information was introduced into a controlled conversation. A minor detail about an upcoming operation. Nothing significant. Nothing that would cause major damage if exposed. But enough to track. If that information reached law enforcement, they would know. Within days, the operation failed. Not dramatically, not violently, but definitively. Authorities were already in place. Waiting. Prepared. The conclusion was unavoidable. Someone inside was talking. And now, they were closer than ever to identifying who. For the man at the center of it all, the shift was immediate, even if he didn't yet understand why. Conversations stopped abruptly when he entered rooms. Assignments became less frequent, and the men who once treated him as invisible now seemed to notice him too much. According to later testimony, this was the most dangerous phase, because by then, suspicion had already formed. All that remained was confirmation. And confirmation, once achieved, triggered a response that was always the same. Swift, final, irreversible. Meanwhile, his cooperation with federal authorities deepened. What had begun as cautious communication evolved into structured debriefings. Hours of testimony, detailed accounts of operations that had never been documented before. He described the mechanics of the organization, how orders were given without being spoken directly, how violence was approved without being explicitly mentioned, how entire criminal enterprises operated beneath the surface of ordinary life. Investigators later stated that his information did more than support existing cases. It reshaped them entirely. For the first time, they weren't just observing organized crime from the outside. They were seeing it from within. But with every detail he provided, the risk increased. Because information moved in both directions. And while he was helping to expose the organization was closing in on him. The second test was more aggressive. This time, the information planted was not minor. It involved money, a significant sum tied to a high-level operation, the kind of detail that would only be known to a limited number of individuals, including him. Again, the pattern repeated. Law enforcement intervened. Precisely. Efficiently. There was no longer any doubt. According to multiple documented accounts, the meeting that followed was brief, closed, and decisive. The conclusion was unanimous. He was the informant. What happened next was not chaotic. It was planned, because in that world, even retaliation followed a structure. A message had to be sent, but it had to be sent correctly. Too public, and it risked law enforcement attention. Too quiet, and it failed to reinforce fear. The balance was critical, and so, a plan was formed, not just to eliminate him, but to make an example of him. Meanwhile, federal authorities began to recognize the severity of the situation. His value as an informant had become undeniable, but so had the danger he faced. According to case files, discussions began regarding relocation, early entry into witness protection, a new identity, a new life, a complete severance from everything he had ever known. But there was a problem: timing. These transitions required preparation, documentation, coordination between agencies. It was not immediate, and time was the one thing he no longer had. Because while federal agents worked through procedures, the organization had already moved into action. Surveillance began, not the kind used by law enforcement. No cameras, no wires, just people, watching, following, waiting. He started to notice it. A car that appeared too often, faces that seemed familiar, even in unfamiliar places. The sense, not of being chased, but of being tracked. According to later reports, this was when panic began to replace calculation. For months, he had operated under the belief that cooperation would protect him. Now, that belief was beginning to collapse. He contacted his handlers more frequently, pushed for faster relocation, expressed concern, real, immediate concern, that his identity had been compromised. The response, while serious, remained procedural. They reassured him, told him to remain calm, told him they were handling it. But the truth was, they were already behind. Because the organization did not operate on procedure, it operated on instinct. An instinct had already confirmed what it needed to know. The plan to eliminate him was set into motion through intermediaries, layers designed to insulate those at the top from direct involvement. Orders were passed without names. Instructions were given without specifics. But everyone involved understood the objective. Find him, confirm, and remove him. According to multiple documented accounts, the final phase began with something deceptively simple. An invitation, not unusual, not suspicious on its surface. A meeting, routine, familiar, framed as business. The kind of interaction he had participated in countless times before. But by then, nothing was routine, and nothing was safe. He hesitated. Investigators later noted that he expressed doubt, told his handlers about the meeting, questioned whether he should attend. The advice he received was cautious but inconclusive. They did not yet have confirmation that the organization knew. And without that confirmation, refusing the meeting could raise even more suspicion. It was a calculated risk, one that had to be made quickly, because declining could expose him, and attending could end him. The decision he made would define everything that followed. According to reconstructed timelines, he agreed to the meeting, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because, deep down, he still believed he could navigate his way out of it. But the truth was far darker, because by the time he made that decision, the outcome had already been determined. The location was chosen carefully, neutral, controlled, isolated enough to avoid attention, but familiar enough not to raise alarm. The men who would be present were selected just as carefully. Faces he knew, voices he trusted, or at least once trusted. According to later investigative reports, the structure of the meeting followed a pattern often used in internal executions. Normalcy first, conversation, routine discussion, then a shift, subtle, almost imperceptible, until it wasn't. Because in that moment, when realization replaces doubt, there is no time to react, no time to escape, only time to understand. And by the time he understood, it was already too late. The film never showed this part. There was no courtroom, no dramatic testimony, no clean transition into a new life. Just a room, a handful of men, and the irreversible consequence of a single decision. But what investigators uncovered afterward would reveal something even more unsettling. Because his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more damaging. A chain reaction that would expose fractures within the organization itself. Fractures that could not be repaired. And as federal authorities began to piece together what had happened, they realized something critical. The informant was gone, but the damage he caused was just starting to surface. The informant was gone, but the damage he caused was just starting to surface. According to multiple documented accounts, the immediate aftermath of his disappearance followed a familiar pattern. There was no public acknowledgement, no official confirmation. Within the organization, his name was no longer spoken. He simply ceased to exist. But outside that world, investigators began to notice something unusual. The flow of information did not stop. In fact, it intensified. Because before the meeting, before the suspicion had fully crystallized, he had already given them enough. Enough names, enough operations, enough structural insight to begin dismantling something that had taken decades to build. The film never showed this part. The slow unraveling. The quiet collapse that doesn't happen in a single moment, but in a series of precise, calculated strikes. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. Using the testimony he had provided, along with corroborating evidence gathered through surveillance and financial records, they began constructing cases that were stronger than anything they had previously attempted. For the first time, they weren't targeting individuals. They were targeting the system itself. And the system was vulnerable. According to investigators, one of the most significant breakthroughs came from understanding communication patterns. The informant had explained how orders were passed indirectly, how language was coded, how intent was implied rather than stated. This allowed authorities to reinterpret recorded conversations that had once seemed meaningless. Suddenly, phrases that appeared harmless carried weight. Meetings that seemed routine became conspiratorial, and relationships that once looked distant were revealed to be deeply connected. Arrests began, not all at once, but steadily, deliberately, each one built upon the last, each one reinforcing the case against those higher up in the hierarchy. Inside the organization, the response was immediate, but not unified, because something had changed. The execution of the informant had been meant to restore order, to eliminate uncertainty, to send a clear message. But instead, it had exposed something far more dangerous. Weakness. According to later testimony, paranoia reached levels the organization had never experienced before. The realization that an informant had operated undetected for so long and had caused such extensive damage forced members to question everything, not just who had betrayed them, but who might betray them next. Trust, already fragile, began to collapse entirely. Meetings became smaller. Communication became more restricted. Decisions that once moved quickly now stalled under layers of doubt. Because every action carried a new risk, not just from law enforcement, but from within, the leadership faced an impossible situation. They had acted decisively. They had eliminated the perceived threat. And yet, the consequences continued to grow. Because the information he had provided could not be undone. It was already in motion, already being used, already reshaping the landscape of organized crime enforcement. According to federal case files, one of the most devastating aspects of his cooperation was not what he revealed, but how he revealed it. He had provided context, structure, meaning. Without that, individual pieces of evidence remained isolated. With it, they became part of a larger narrative. A narrative that prosecutors could present in court. A narrative that juries could understand. And most importantly, a narrative that could lead to convictions. The trials that followed were not dramatic. There were no sudden confessions, no emotional breakdowns, just methodical presentations of evidence, financial records, recorded conversations, witness testimony, and behind it all, his words. Even in death, his voice remained. According to multiple documented accounts, several high-ranking members were convicted as a direct result of the information he had provided. Sentences were long, in some cases, effectively permanent. For an organization built on permanence, it was a devastating blow. But the damage extended beyond prison sentences. It altered behavior. Surviving members became more cautious, sometimes to the point of paralysis. Operations that once generated significant income were scaled back or abandoned entirely. Because risk had changed, the old rules no longer guaranteed safety, and the idea of another informant, another unseen threat, became impossible to ignore. The film never showed how deeply that fear embedded itself. Because fear, unlike violence, does not leave visible evidence, but it changes everything. According to investigators, the most telling shift was not in what the organization did, but in what it stopped doing. Large-scale operations declined, communication networks fractured, and recruitment slowed, because bringing in new people meant introducing new uncertainty. And uncertainty, after what had happened, was no longer acceptable. Meanwhile, within law enforcement, his case became something else entirely. A reference point, a demonstration of what was possible when an insider chose to cooperate, but also a cautionary example, because his ending was not the one that had been promised. There was no relocation, no new identity, no quiet life under government protection, just a disappearance, followed by confirmation, followed by silence. Investigators later acknowledged that timing had failed him. Procedures had delayed action, and in that delay, the organization had moved faster. It was a reality that could not be ignored. and one that would shape how future informants were handled. Because after his case, adjustments were made. Protocols were revised. Relocation processes were accelerated, not out of efficiency, but out of necessity. Because the lesson was clear. In that world, hesitation was fatal. But for those still inside organized crime, the lesson was different and far more brutal. According to multiple documented accounts, the story of his betrayal and his death circulated quietly among members, not as a detailed account, but as a warning, a reinforcement of the code. Because despite the damage he had caused, one principle remained unchanged. Omerta, silence, absolute, unquestioned. The consequences of breaking it had been demonstrated once again. But the irony, one that was never acknowledged within that world, was that his cooperation had achieved something no internal enforcement ever could. It had exposed the system itself, not just its operations, but its vulnerabilities. And once those vulnerabilities were understood, they could be exploited again and again and again. The long-term impact of his actions extended far beyond the immediate cases. Law enforcement strategies evolved. Prosecutors became more aggressive, and the reliance on insider testimony became a central component of organized crime investigations. Because one informant, just one, had proven how much damage could be done, even after death. The film never showed how it really ended. Not with a man walking into a courtroom, not with a neatly packaged conclusion, but with a system slowly breaking under the weight of its own exposure. And at the center of it all, a man who had once believed that loyalty would protect him. A man who chose to speak and paid for it, but in doing so, changed everything. Because in the end, the truth was never about survival. It was about consequence. And in the world he came from, consequences never disappeared. They waited, they spread, and eventually, they consumed everything.